I was still an atheist, and yet here was the leading atheist ethicist of the time, and he was arguing positions which were completely at odds with assumptions that I had always just assumed were entirely consistent with my atheism.
No, I don't think it's problematic to say the 4-month-old baby is not actually a person. I think that's simply true.
On the one hand, Dawkins and other new atheists are committed to arguing there is no ultimate morality, and yet on the other hand, there are often these highly moral claims that they want everybody to assent to. That made me rethink whether or not atheism could actually sustain my deepest ethical convictions. My first encounters with Christianity happened at Cambridge through encountering the very people that I was studying for my PhD thesis. One of the most important ideas that spurred them to pursue the experimental method was a sense of the effects that sin, the fall, had not only on our moral capacities, but actually on human cognition. What I was starting to realize is that I'd kind of been living a life in which I had been trying to attain my own self-worth through hard work and through achievement, and living as if that kind of intellectual or academic success were ultimate. In a culture in which secular culture's kind of highest ideal is self-invention, there's no real place for history.
So good to be joined by Sarah Irving-Stonebraker now to talk about her journey from atheism to Christian faith and some of the influential figures along the way, including some of the new atheists who were part of that journey. Sarah is a historian and author of the book Priests of History, Stewarding the Past in an Ahistoric Age, as well as a contributor to the book Coming to Faith through Dawkins. Sarah, thank you very much for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Justin.
Tell us a little bit about your background growing up and so on, because I don't think you were raised in a particularly religious household at all, were you?
Yeah, no, not at all. So I'm Australian, and I was brought up in a really loving family in the city of Sydney, which is very cosmopolitan, global city. And I was brought up by parents who were very academic. My father is or was a professor of government at the University of Sydney, and they always encouraged us to really pursue ideas, to seek after the truth and to grapple with the big questions. But it was a completely secular household, actually. And so while we were doing this and having all kinds of wonderful conversations around the meal times and the dinner table, as it were, it was a secular childhood. And so I really didn't encounter Christianity in any real way, to be honest, until I came to study at the University of Cambridge as a postgraduate student when I was doing my PhD.
You actually had a desire to go to Cambridge from quite an early age. Tell us about where that came from.
Yes. Well, gosh, how could you not? So when I was young, I wanted to be a historian since I was 8 years old. And part of that, I think, was because my father's a historian, and we went on this very formative trip to England when I was 8. And we went to Oxford and Cambridge, and we went to Warwick Castle, and the past, I think, captured my imagination. And so from then on, I wanted to study at Oxford and Cambridge, and I wanted to be, more importantly, I wanted to be a historian. And that really gave me a sense of, I think, who I was in life and really what life was all about for me. And I think actually when I reflect upon it, in many ways, that sense that I knew what life was all about, I knew who I was, I think contributed quite early on to a sense when I was a child and a teenager that I didn't need God, because I sort of thought that I didn't have any kind of searching questions that God might be able to answer, as kind of naive and arrogant as that sounds, because I had this sense that I know what my life is all about, I know who I am, I know where I'm going, and so forth.
When you arrived at Cambridge as a postgraduate, was it postgraduate that you arrived to do studies for?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
PhD in history.
Would you have kind of described yourself as an atheist at that point, or was it something you didn't really think that hard about?
Oh, yes. I definitely thought of myself as an atheist. And this was partly because I think growing up in that very cosmopolitan city like Sydney, and also somebody for whom academic pursuits were very important, thinking about atheism and defining oneself as a sort of critic of religion seemed to be particularly important to me. So yes, I saw myself as an atheist. And actually some of my first encounters with Christianity actually happened at Cambridge, and they actually happened through encountering the very people that I was studying for my PhD thesis, which is really interesting. So one of the things that I assumed as an atheist and never really delved into was this idea that Christianity was in some kind of fundamental opposition with science. And I began doing my PhD, and I was really exploring quite deeply. We'd now probably use the term scientist to describe people like Francis Bacon and Robert Boyle, one of the founders, in Boyle's case, of modern chemistry. But they were natural philosophers of nature. And I was really interested. I was a historian of empire and really interested in the relationship between the history of science, the history of empire. And yet it soon became apparent that not only did these, Boyle and Bacon in particular, but also others, Isaac Newton, take their faith very seriously, but also that their Christian faith was really at the very core of what they were doing. And so what I had dismissed, to be honest, as intellectual window dressing was actually, the more I read, for example, of Robert Boyle, the more I found him a man of deep Christian faith. And this was a kind of pebble in my shoe, as it were. It made me, it was a kind of stumbling block to my atheism. It by no means made me a Christian right then and there or anything, but it made me really need to take seriously this idea that one could be a deep intellect committed to what then is the foundation of modern science, and yet also a deeply theological thinker and a profoundly committed Christian, in Boyle's case in particular.
Yeah, so this, at least, as you say, put a pebble in your shoe, made you realise that the situation wasn't quite as simple as you perhaps understood. How did things progress then? Because you were obviously in a very intellectual setting at Cambridge University. You were dealing with big ideas. That's the idea when you're at university. What were some of the other ideas that were being brought up alongside this study of these scientific pioneers and so on?
Yes, well, I think really the next kind of major thing that happened for me was that after I finished my PhD, I was elected to a junior research fellowship at the University of Oxford. And when I was at Oxford, Professor Peter Singer, who's one of the world's leading ethicists and philosophers, came to Oxford to give a series of lectures in ethics, the You Are Hero lectures. And I was, very much an atheist, but some of my friends were going to Singer's lectures, and I was really excited, of course, to go along too. Not the least bit excited too, because of course Singer is a fellow Australian. He was at Princeton at the time, but it was great to hear his Australian accent in the halls of Oxford. And the interesting thing is, so Singer's lectures were about, in a nutshell, they're really about our duties to others, and really grappled more deeply with the question, the kind of foundational question there, which is the value of human life. Because Singer, of course, being a utilitarian and also an atheist, actually pursues atheism in many ways to its kind of logical conclusion when it comes to grappling with this issue of, well, to what extent is human life inherently valuable? Singer says, well, no, there's no inherent value to human life. That's something of a kind of religious myth, a Christian fiction, which is actually entirely consistent with atheism, because the ultimate reality is not in any way spiritual if you were an atheist. And so I actually left Singer's lectures with a kind of intellectual vertigo, as it were, because I was still an atheist, and yet here was the kind of the leading atheist ethicist of the time, and he was arguing positions which were completely at odds with assumptions that I had kind of not really thought through, to be honest, but had always just assumed were entirely consistent with my atheism. the main one, of course, is this idea that, well, every human life is of equal moral worth and inherently precious and valuable. I'd always thought that was simply the case. And I'd also always really kind of assumed that that was something that all reasonable people would agree upon. And yet it's very clear from Singer's work, and I went away from those lectures and read more about Singer and read, of course, Singer's work. And that is, of course, not a position which is sustained by atheism whatsoever. And so this really, in many ways, was a kind of turning point in the sense that it made me rethink whether or not atheism could actually sustain my deepest ethical convictions.
Wow. So you were being prompted to think about these issues really for the first time by an atheist philosopher, Peter Singer, in this case. And Singer himself, I think, was willing to acknowledge that where that value you held about the inherent dignity and equality of all life was essentially a religious view. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's exactly right. What he says. In fact, in his philosophy, I won't go into it too much, but no, in fact, so his position is, look, if we want to think about ideas about human rights, for example, or rights that humans might have vis-a-vis rights that animals might have and so forth, we need to come up with an understanding of what this concept of personhood is. And in order to qualify for personhood, as it were, we need to kind of, in Singer's view, understand that people have different capacities, and different capacities mean that people, for example, who are profoundly intellectually disabled, for example, don't have those kinds of capacities. And so there's no inherent, as you were saying, there's no inherent sense of the value of human life whatsoever.
So as you were grappling with these ideas, where did this leave you feeling? You said it was a sort of intellectual vertigo. Did you feel like you could get sort of take on board Singer's perspective? Did you try to kind of live with that kind of ethic for a while, that maybe our value is basically a factor of our abilities, our capacities, our ability to reason and so on?
Yeah. I remember thinking through that question a lot. But really, I think the other thing that was going on for me at the same time was that a sort of much more, because so far that this story is quite an intellectual one, which it is, but at the same time there's a far more personal side to this as well, which is that by this time I was in my mid-20s, and it struck me that I'd been very much kind of living a life of where I was basically trying to attain my own self-worth, and this had worked out remarkably well, but yet that's in many ways that's the funny thing about it, isn't it? That I realised by the time I got into Oxford, I basically, mine is on some personal level, a story of somebody who has, had these great dreams, and through various, circumstances, providence, has been able to achieve at the 8-year-old who dreams of going to Cambridge from the other side of the world and gets there, right? But here's the thing, it was soon becoming apparent that the more you achieve, the fellowship, the book contract, or whatever it is, the more there is simply another rung of the ladder. And so in many ways, this kind of personal story and intellectual story were kind of coming together at the same time, as it were, because what I was starting to realize is that I'd kind of been living a life in which I had been trying to attain my own self-worth through hard work and through achievement, and living as if that kind of intellectual or academic success were ultimate. Now, that's not to say for a moment that the academic achievement isn't a good thing and an important thing. And later, when I became a Christian, read the Bible, there is an enormous emphasis upon the importance of using one's mind, because God gave us minds, and pursuing wisdom, which begins with God. But my problem is that I turned that into an ultimate thing. I sort of came to realize this rather slowly, but I turned that into the thing that I lived for, and what was becoming evident in my mid-20s, that, the kind of high point in one's young life, as it were, is that if that becomes the ultimate thing, the thing that you live for, even when it seems to kind of keep on giving, it's never, ever enough. And so actually what had happened is that when those two things kind of came together, I went through a period of really trying to ask more deeply, both intellectually and personally, well, what is the alternative story then? And I remember that one day, one kind of winter actually, I was in the college library at Wolfson at Oxford, and I'd always had my desk, strangely enough, in front of the theology section, and I'd never really bothered to venture into that section of the library. And I decided to wander along the shelves, and I picked up various books of sermons, and I started to read. I think, to be honest, I didn't want to go near a Bible, but I started to read sermons. And what I discovered was that I had actually never understood theology. I'd never even thought deeply about Christianity at all. And actually, the theology, the actual biblical story about who God is and who humankind is, I mean, humanity, which is so profoundly corrupt and sinful, and who has rejected God and yet has this kind of yearning sense that this world is not ultimately what we are made for or who we are made for, started to make profound sense for me. And of course, growing up as a millennial, the concept of sin is a difficult one to think through. And it takes some years, right? But what those sermons and what I, after that, sort of started to read theology and eventually the Bible, what this started to reveal to me was that actually the Bible story about who we are and who God is and how we have sinned and rejected God, and how with paying this ultimate cost, there is the perfect human, Christ himself, God himself in Christ, who has actually lived the perfect life and then died in our place. That story, very slowly, made not only intellectual sense to me, but was profoundly personally compelling, because it was abundantly clear that I was yearning for something that only God himself could satisfy. I later learned, that famous line from St. Augustine that talks about our hearts being restless until they find their rest in you, Lord. And Augustine's Confessions, reading that. And gosh, I'd say to anyone listening, if you haven't read Augustine's Confessions, read them. They're so good. They're just so incredibly profound. But that kind of sense of yearning was exactly what I was experiencing.
So you were going on this journey. You were reading books of sermons in your college library. Did you at some point take the brave step of going into a church? Did you establish any friendships with Christians at this time?
Yes. So this is a kind of, period of a few years here. I didn't step into a church earnestly seeking God, I think, until I was in America. So I had got a tenure track academic job at Florida State University in Tallahassee. And I found myself in that city sort of profoundly after a while, very much on my own. And I think that gave me the freedom eventually, after a kind of personal sort of relationship breakdown and sort of mini crisis, to be honest, to actually walk into church as somebody who was actually humbly seeking God, actually wondering what this was all about. And so I walked into church one Sunday by myself in Tallahassee, and that was a really unsettling but also profoundly beautiful experience, because in many ways the world outside, and particularly if you've for me, growing up in a very kind of secular society in which all things are very much very mundane, but then entering church for the first time, this was a church in which there was a liturgy and they celebrated the Lord's Supper. And I remember that there was a kind of and perhaps too, because I'm a historian and so drawn to the profundity of all things historical, and this idea that people have been uttering since Christ himself utters these words, this is my body, broken for you. the people have been uttering these words, singing these psalms and these hymns for generations. There was a kind of stability and truth and groundedness there that I was yearning for, that in the outside world, in which all was kind of mundane and transient, that the Lord's Supper that morning invited me, not that I could take it, I'd never been baptized, but there was an invitation there which I wanted to accept, but which I couldn't at that point because I hadn't been baptized. That there was an invitation there to be grafted into to have a relationship with God and to be grafted into a people that was not only a horizontal kind of church across the world, but actually a people through time. And that was really profound. Anyway, there was, several kind of months of rather feebly kind of attending church and not knowing what all this was really all about, and taking the catechism classes, taught very, very faithfully and hearing really good preaching and starting to read the Bible. And anyway, I was just 28 when I was baptized, in Tallahassee.
There you go. Hi, Justin here. Hope you're enjoying the conversation. Just to say, if you'd like a free chapter of my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, I'll send it to you when you join my newsletter. Just visit justinbrierley.com. The link is with the info below. Now, back to the conversation. I'm sure you've done a lot of putting the pieces together since that time as well, and there's obviously we all go on a continuing journey. But what difference did it make at that? Well, firstly, I suppose an intellectual level. Did it feel like you were able to now reconcile that deep sense you had of the value of human life that had been challenged by Peter Singer, because you saw it from this new perspective?
Yes, absolutely. And I think too, because I'm a historian and because an academic historian, therefore you're teaching, lecturing to students, taking seminars with students, in history, again and again, you encounter the lives of people. If you encounter, for example, when I teach the British Empire or any kind of modern empire or ancient empire, you encounter, for example, the lives of slaves. You encounter the lives of women. You encounter the lives of those whose lives the Bible says are infinitely precious. The lives of those who are otherwise, however, discarded and ignored, the least of these in many ways. And I think for me that becoming a Christian and obviously, the more that I over the years read and understood of the Bible and of theology and of God's incredible, not only sort of value for human life, but the way in which God uses the least of these, that has enabled me to bring to my own studies of history and indeed to my own teaching of history a kind of sense in which not only is there kind of purpose to this story, but of the sense in which the kind of the most vulnerable and the marginalized are actually incredibly important part of God's story.
And at a personal level as well, was there some answer to that sense of the next rung never being quite enough in terms of personal satisfaction?
Yes. I mean, this is not the interesting thing, and I think it's really important to say this for a number of reasons. But when I became a Christian, when one becomes a Christian, it's not as if, some light has suddenly switched in terms of one's life instantly being able, and one's understanding instantly being able to change. This is, growth. God helps you grow, but, growth can be painful and growth can be slow. But, yes, definitely this sense that what I yearn for in life and seek after and pursue, and the way I end up spending the time that God's given me on this earth and whatever gifts he's given me, that has completely changed, that has altered. I am still called to be, many things apart from a child of God, but I still have this vocation that God has given me as a historian, pursuing historical truth and teaching students. And that's incredibly, it's an important calling. It's not for one moment as if God devalues the mind or anything like that. In fact, we're to love God with all of our minds. but it is no longer for me the ultimate thing. It is now part of a story of somebody who's created in God's image and called to, given a life in which I want to serve him, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So it's an amazing story. You tell it really well in the chapter of the book Coming to Faith through Dawkins. Dawkins is obviously on the front cover of the book. Now, your story deals more with another of the new atheists, Peter Singer,
yes.
more directly. But you do mention Dawkins, and that the fact that in your view there seems to be a sort of a bit of an incoherence sometimes in the way he talks about morality. Do you want to just spell that out a little bit, and why you think that sometimes even the best known spokesperson for atheism, it doesn't always seem to speak coherently on the issue of human dignity and value?
Yeah, sure. I mean, and yeah, it's often not just Dawkins, is it? Because I think often there's a kind of inconsistency in the sense that on the one hand, Dawkins and other new atheists are committed to arguing, look, there is no ultimate morality, there's no objective truth, and yet and so they shouldn't really be making any kind of moral claims. And yet, on the other hand, there are often these kind of highly moral claims that they want everybody to assent to, and yet they can't ground. So, for example, I just remember Dawkins in one particular interview talked about how, look, nature is blind, pitiless, and indifferent, his famous phrase there, and also it's kind of red in tooth and claw, but I don't want to live in a world like that. And therefore, there'll be, to paraphrase him, he'll encourage people to go and be kind and compassionate and so forth to one another. And yet there's a kind of deep logical inconsistency there, isn't there? Because if there is no ultimate morality, and indeed if Christian morality is just a fiction, then the idea somehow that everybody ought to be compassionate or loving to one another or respect each other's rights and so forth, all of these things fall down.
Yeah, and I guess there's that old sort of that the is of science doesn't equal an ought of how you ought to live your life. There's a sense in which Dawkins and many of the new atheists are very well known for their scientific acumen and everything else, but it doesn't necessarily buy you a moral world, does it?
No, that's right. And I think that's also something that really struck me, because in my life, one of the things that I had to confront when I did all this reading of the new atheists was that moral feelings, moral intuitions are one thing, but the idea that one ought to live in a particular way is quite another. So while I might have particular moral feelings about the innate sanctity of human life and the value of human life, if there's no way of grounding them, then I lack integrity, really, if I'm an atheist, because I'm assenting to a series of moral views that actually can't be grounded in atheism in the first place, in a kind of cosmically accidental universe.
You are a Christian now, and you've been continuing, though, as a historian, researching, writing. You've got a really exciting book. Just give us a sketch of what it's all about, Sarah.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's called Priests of History, Stewarding the Past in an Ahistoric Age. And basically, I put forward the idea that we are now living in an age which is profoundly disconnected from history. And really to the point where I think, and so I kind of coined the phrase that we should call this the ahistoric age, in the sense that our contemporary kind of Western culture is so... I think really that it has a few attitudes towards the past. It's ignorant of the past. It thinks that history in the past is irrelevant, or it reduces history to just an ideological battleground. And so I'm just so struck by the fact that we kind of are living in an age now, and I see this particularly with our students and young people, in which they don't see themselves as part of historical communities, in which we don't know how to meaningfully engage with the past without turning it into an ideological battleground, and in a culture in which our kind of secular culture's kind of highest ideal is self-invention, there's no real place for history. There's no real place for this idea that there might be a larger narrative, a more profound story. And so really this book is me as a Christian who is an academic historian, associate professor of history now, but also drawing on my experience as an atheist who's become a Christian, grappling with this question of, well, what is history? What does it mean to now live in a culture in which we are just ahistorical? What is history? Why does it matter? And also, how can Christians engage meaningfully with the past? Because I think that if we can really engage well with history, it can be enormously helpful for us. It grounds our faith. I think it helps us communicate the gospel really effectively. But I think it can also help to just strengthen us spiritually and intellectually as Christians.
It's such an interesting thesis. We're living in an ahistorical age. Where do you think this happened? Why did this happen? I suppose I want to know why. What evidence you saw that at one time we were more aware of our historical roots and being part of a bigger story. What did that look like? And when did it change? Why did it change to where we're sort of unmoored almost from our historical context as a human species?
Yeah, that's such an important question. I sort of posit that the ahistoric age is really a kind of moment in this kind of more profound shift to what's often kind of referred to as like late modernity, in which there's a kind of sense that there are no longer any kind of overarching narratives that are agreed upon that can give a kind of coherent or that there's a consensus about these narratives that can give us a kind of sense of a shared ideal, a shared vision of the good life. But I think there's a particular kind of ahistorical sense in which all of this is taking place, in that in previous generations, people thought of themselves as part of historical communities. But I think particularly in the past decade or so, and I think in no small part, I don't go too much into the causes in my book, but in no small part actually because of the advent of the internet and social media, there's this constant kind of reinvention, self-invention obviously, and recreation of the present in a way in which we no longer, and of course a kind of hyper-individualism, which kind of contributes to this sense that we're not formed by history. We don't need to understand ourselves as products of history. And indeed, that anything that we value, we don't even think that its heritage or its history might be important. So, for example, it always strikes me that one of the things that my undergraduate students at various different universities that I've been at, they've really liked to talk about individual rights and so forth, and yet they have no understanding really of their history, their heritage, right? They have a very profoundly Christian heritage in terms of their origins. And yet, so we can have these kind of ideas, but the notion that even the values that we hold very dearly might have a history that we need to know, and that we need to know about history in order to kind of situate ourselves and become good citizens and become part of society and socialize ourselves. Those kinds of ideas now are they seem kind of outdated. And in fact, we view the past with a kind of suspicion. We don't really know why it's useful. And actually history the statistics actually across Britain, America and Australia actually of people studying history for the equivalent of A-levels in the UK and even at undergraduate level are really rapidly declining.
I think C.S. Lewis termed it chronological snobbery, this idea that all that is good is what's happening now and being written now, and people sort of regard, ancient wisdom as somehow always retrograde. So if that's kind of what's going on in our culture at the moment, what are we losing? What is the story that we have lost, essentially, that we've kind of lost touch with, especially in the West, I suppose? What would you say that it is that we've lost, and what are the effects of that?
Yeah. Well, the story that we've lost is one of them, but the most important one is the historical story of Christianity and the way in which Christianity has shaped, in particular, Western civilizations' most deeply held values. And I think, for me, one of the most interesting things actually writing this book, in many ways, was to speak to other Christians because, while, of course, secular culture in the West has lost these stories, actually, I think that Christians in the church need to here that we've kind of lost a historical sense of Christianity as well. What I mean by that is that I think Christians increasingly, increasingly in the sort of in the Protestant West in particular, which is the that part of the contemporary church that I'm most familiar with, no longer really have a sense that they are, when they become a Christian, grafted into a historical people in which there might be historical traditions and a history of theology as well, historical intellectual traditions and spiritual traditions that might, in fact, be incredibly important for us. And so, for example, when I speak to some young friends who in their early 20s as uni students become Christians, one of their most pressing questions is, what does this mean? What do I do? And so what is it? How do I become a Christian? And they're yearning for this sense that actually they're wanting to be invited into a community that actually has practices and traditions that can pass down the faith. And yet increasingly, and part of this complex constellation of cultural phenomena, I think, but increasingly with the phenomenon of, going for your spiritual life to an app for the day, for example, there's this kind of sense that Christianity is just a kind of very highly individualized, momentary set of kind of things that like propositions I agree with. It's a kind of propositional faith. I believe this and therefore, but no real sense that actually there are then demands on my life that I'm committed and brought into a community that actually can offer me incredible historical grounding and a sense of how to actually to live out this faith in life.
So that's kind of a really helpful way of seeing the way that this impacts Christians as much as anyone else. This loss of this sort of sense of being part of a historical community, the communion of saints, in a sense, is what you're describing there, and the fact that we're meant to live this life alongside others. There are certain practices that have developed that help us to ground that faith and to live fruitfully in the world, and we're increasingly forgetful of that. I mean, at a larger level, you talk about the fact that the culture itself sort of has forgotten that story. What are the stories it's telling itself now? And I guess this goes a bit beyond just the historical inquiry that you've made, but what will be the results of that, in a sense? Can we live on those stories for very long? Or do you think there is... I mean, my thesis in my book, and to some extent this documentary podcast, is that perhaps we're kind of running out of steam because those stories are not satisfying people. They're not answering those deepest questions and longings they have. And there might be a case for saying that the Christian story may yet come back in as people reach the end of their tether, as it were. What do you think? I'd just be interested in your thoughts on all of that.
Yes. No, I think you put it really well there, Justin. I agree. And in fact, what stories, and they're very kind of limited stories that the culture has, are in many ways a kind of almost schizophrenic mishmash of what were formerly Christian ideals, but of which have, for example, there's still a kind of yearning for justice or yearning for free ideals which are deeply and richly grounded biblically and in the history of Christian theology, but which have been sort of completely unmoored from that theological, biblical and historical grounding, and which are somehow these kind of ideas that are now kind of haphazardly tacked onto individual desires. So like, I desire freedom, but there's no kind of real grounded, rich sense of what freedom is. So those stories, I completely agree with what you said about the fact that these stories really are partial and they're transient and they're going nowhere. And I think the other thing that is important to add to that is that this story, well, this is sort of paraphrasing Stanley Hauerwas here, who says that really the only story in this contemporary neoliberal society, that the only story I have is my own, in the sense that there's only a kind of highly individual story, because this is a culture of just relentless self-invention. We no longer kind of really, as a culture in the West, invite our children into a heritage, into a story. It's basically all about the story that you invent for yourself. And I hazard that this is, yes, in no small part behind the kind of massive mental health epidemic we have, where young people, of course they're anxious. They're basically cast loose in the world and basically being told to go and invent themselves. So there's the only story we have is our own individual story. So yeah, I agree that I hope that it will become clear anyway as a culture that whatever kind of partial, transient, almost parodies in some way, cruel parodies of other stories that we have will be shown to just be that. Yeah.
I mean, it might get worse before it gets better, arguably. But what's your hope, I suppose, do you think the church is in a position to tell that story again compellingly to people, or do you think there's a long way to go there?
I think we are. And I think too, when you look at where Christianity is growing in the world, it's growing in the third world, in the global south, and there is much hope the church is growing. It's hard to, and I'm not sure we ought to be really in the business of trying to sort of work out too much what God is doing in the church in different parts of the world, as it were, or where geographically that hope is going to come from. But the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. And so there is hope. There's hope for God's church. And I think that there is hope in particular, I think, if those of us who have been exposed to and who can keep kind of passing down history and dealing well with history, being able to engage well with church history and telling this story, acknowledging sin where it has been committed in the name of Christianity, and also holding up the profound good that has come from the history of Christianity. I think there's a real opportunity there to be able to communicate the gospel to a world which is actually profoundly rootless and unmoored.
Just for anyone, but be they Christian or not, who might be watching or listening and hearing you talk about the way we become unmoored from history and some of the effects of that on our life, what would, I guess, just at a very practical level, some tips be for the individual who wants to sort of connect more with the bigger story, with where they're from, the culture that they were birthed into, and so on? Is it just about getting back into our history books? What might be some of the practical ways we can do that?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's really about reading about the past and engaging with history in such a way that it actually shapes families. So in my book, for example, and when I say family, I don't just mean sort of biological, I mean church families, brothers and sisters that we will call our brothers and sisters and disciple in the church. In the book, I have a couple of chapters on sort of really trying to turn to the practical applications of this. So there's a kind of chapter on how we can actually strengthen our intellectual formation by turning to and kind of reviving the kind of long conversation with which Christianity has kind of been part of. But another chapter actually is about spiritual formation. And in that chapter, I kind of look at I delve back into the 17th century, one of my sort of periods of expertise in history, back into 17th century England. And I look at I explore a family who lived in the tiny village called Little Gidding in Huntingdonshire during the English Civil War. And the Farrar family, and they had these incredible spiritual practices. So, for example, they keep a night vigil, which I go into. And so I sort of describe how actually in the 17th century, this kind of spiritual formation of, praying the daily office is another example, which has been passed down, I think, a lot more richly in some parts of the church than, say, a night vigil, or even there's a spiritual practice that they engage in of reading aloud during a kind of communal meal, in which they kind of often practice hospitality as well. And so they're reading aloud and communicating these stories. Anyway, in this particular chapter, I kind of look at these as real practical examples of how actually if we engage with the past and we can delve into our history, it can actually be enormously fruitful for us. Because I think that we can actually practice things like a night vigil or praying that. So I talk in the book about my family's been praying the daily office in various ways for the last several years, trying to do that with our kids and trying to do that with our small group from church. And so I think actually these things can be enormously practical too.
The surprising rebirth of belief in God has been making waves since its launch. Now you can listen to all of Season 1. Discover the story of why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. Featuring interviews with leading thinkers across the faith spectrum, you'll learn the inside account of the rise and fall of new atheism. All 30 episodes of Season 1 of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God are available now. Find out why we've become a #1 ranked religion and spirituality podcast when you jump in at episode 1. Go to justinbrierley.com/surprisingrebirth to subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. That's justinbrierley.com.
So there is this popular sort of narrative, I think, in a lot of circles, especially one that was propounded by new atheists, Sarah, that science and faith are at odds. The more we know about science, the less reason we have for God. But it also applies to the history of science as well. A lot of the examples that are given of the way in which supposedly the church has been a hindrance to scientific progress and so on, people will bring up, issues like the trial of Galileo and other things to kind of argue for that. But tell us a little bit firstly about the actual story of the scientific revolution, because this is something you've studied in some detail. Who were the people who actually got the scientific revolution going, and what was their motivation in doing so?
Yeah. Well, they were all Christians. That's a fairly simple way of answering this question, but they were all Christians. But the interesting thing is, and this is the really important thing to understand, is that actually, far from being a hindrance, their faith in many ways, and in many different ways, the story is complicated, but in many ways, they actually pursued what we now call science, and back then, more accurate term was the philosophy of nature, natural philosophy, but they pursue it for theological reasons. I think one of the best illustrations of this, and one of the things that, to be honest, when I was a PhD student at Cambridge, and still at that time an atheist, really struck me, is this particular illustration. So it's really about the origins of the experimental method, right? Absolutely central to the modern experimental sciences. But the pioneers of the experimental method, and it really begins in Oxford in the 1660s. Robert Boyle, my sort of, dear old friend by this point, who've been studying in at Cambridge, but also his close colleague, Robert Hooke. And the interesting thing is that one of the most important ideas that spurred them to pursue the experimental method was a sense of the effects that sin, so the fall, had not only on our moral capacities, but actually on human cognition. There's basically this idea, and there's particularly in this context, it's a particularly Protestant idea, because one of the very Protestant beliefs of the 17th century is to really emphasize how profoundly the fall, and therefore sin, affects the human mind and the human senses. And basically what Hooke in particular, and Boyle and others, end up arguing is that it's precisely because human cognition is so fallen and affected by sin, we can't rely upon unaided reason to kind of intuit God's order of the universe just by reading it like a book. Nature, in fact, has to be experimented upon. We actually have to, in some ways, compensate for how tarnished our cognition is, but also how tarnished our senses are because of the fall in order to do this. And in Hooke's really famous work called Micrographia, which is a wonderful, and if you read it, there are diagrams of the early microscopes. It's wonderful, but it's basically on the microscope and on the experimental method and how to use it. And in the preface to that work, published in 1665, Hooke, and I'll paraphrase him for a moment because it's really memorable, but what Hooke says is that one of the sort of the reason for needing to develop a microscope and develop this experimental method is to compensate for the profound effects of sin on the human senses. So in other words, we need to pursue nature, pursue it through this experimental method, precisely because even though there is an ordered universe and a God of order, whose order can eventually be understood, we need to do this in a way that makes sense of and kind of compensates for how profoundly affected the human senses are and the human reason is by sin itself. And that idea is one of the driving forces behind the experimental method.
It'd be fascinating to hear more about the sort of the motivations of those scientific pioneers then, Sarah, and to what extent their Christian faith was fueling their sense that science and their study and contemplation of the universe was also important for moral progress, for, some sense of God's kingdom, being established and so on.
Yes, that's a really fascinating idea. And in fact, I find that that's one of the most, one of the ideas that really captures when I teach the history of scientific revolutions, really captures the imagination of students, because in many ways, one of the most distinctive features of modern science is that we believe that modern science ought to have some kind of human benefit. I mean, if you look at even why, one of the ways I even begin some of my classes on this is to talk about the fact that the defining feature of at least modern scientific grant applications really is, can you prove that this will actually help and improve human society? There's a kind of modern understanding, secularized now, but of progress that kind of underpins that. But the really kind of fascinating thing lying beneath this is that there was not always this sense that the study of the natural world would be connected with any kind of idea that this knowledge would contribute to a kind of profound, overarching sense of improving that world. There are particular kind of uses for things. For example, in the study of ancient astronomy, for example, and medieval astronomy, can we create the church calendar? Particular uses, but this kind of broader idea that the knowledge of nature ought to be useful in some way to improving human life. And even when I use that phrase, improving human life, I'm actually quoting one of the founders of modern science there, Francis Bacon. That is a profoundly a Christian idea, which is really distinct to the foundations of modern science. It's a really Christian idea for various theological reasons. But to kind of simplify, it's this understanding that, and in many ways, this particular idea, it's really important in Reformation theology. The idea is that, look, God is building his kingdom, and that knowledge actually has a particularly important role to play. And indeed, if there is a kind of priesthood of all believers and all people, all Christians are kind of called to participate in the kind of building of God's kingdom, then natural knowledge plays a role in improving human life. And so Francis Bacon, one of the most important sort of 17th century natural philosophers, for various reasons, and the origins of modern science, he uses this phrase, like I said, that natural knowledge ought to be used for the improvement of human life. And he even, to paraphrase one of his most, I think one of the most fascinating things that he says in the New Organon, which is kind of his new scientific method, really, is that he basically says that in the fall, humanity kind of declined from their state of innocence, both kind of morally and in terms of their knowledge, both of which can in some way be repaired in this life, the former by the Christian faith, religion and faith, and the latter by the arts and sciences. So basically what he's saying there, and it's actually a profoundly radical and quite new application of a theological idea in the 17th century, which is actually we don't just contemplate the natural world, we produce knowledge that ought to be profoundly useful for human life. And the creation of practical applied knowledge, which actually in the medieval worldview was not, though that kind of really practical knowledge was kind of even mathematics for various reasons, was not viewed as a proper part of philosophy. There's a whole kind of intellectual shift that takes place, and what eventually becomes modern science has at its very core this idea that the kind of knowledge we produce ought to be useful. And that idea at its heart is a theological one.
So helpful. I mean, some surveys appear to show that scientists today are more likely to not believe in God. A lot of people have taken that as a sign that essentially, yes, science does lead to atheism or non-belief. A sort of scientific, rational view of the world expels thoughts of the supernatural, divine providence and so on, Sarah. I mean, is that true? Is science fundamentally something that kind of, in the end, does sort of give people a reason to not believe in God? What's your feeling on that?
Well, at its core, even in order to answer that question, there's a kind of prior question, which is, what is science in the business of doing? What are the kinds of questions that science is trying to answer? And what are the kinds of questions that faith is trying to answer? Now, many contemporary scientists in various different fields, and I'm sure that you're talking to many of them, and there are many out there in great conversations at universities like Cambridge and MIT and Harvard. They are entirely, Francis Collins, who led the project to sequence the human genome, they are at the forefront of their field, and yet also devout Christians. And so, there are all kinds of, I guess, so the first kind of way of responding to that question is, let's look at some of the scientists in their fields today who are leaders in their fields, who in fact are entirely able to reconcile their faith with science because they have a clear understanding of the kinds of answers, if you like, or the kinds of questions and answers that their science investigates about the world, and the more profound questions and the deeper questions that that faith answers about the world as well. Now, as a historian, I would always approach that question historically, and that is to say that actually, in terms of the foundations of modern science, the best way of kind of articulating that is that modern science was in many ways kind of founded through and by Christians, and in many ways premised on a deeply Christian theological view of the universe, and indeed of human capacity, human senses, and so epistemological questions there as well as metaphysical ones. Obviously, in the history of science and Christianity, there are kind of moments of conflict in the sense that, there are kind of episodes in which particular scientists, if they have a view that science answers all the ultimate questions, then there are kind of, obviously there's those kind of episodes in which people will claim, well, obviously you can't have a situation in which you can claim that science answers all the questions if that is your kind of ultimate viewpoint, then of course that leaves no space for faith. But I would suggest that actually the truth is borne out by the fact that, no, there are plenty of Christians who are scientists in a number of fields today who would have no trouble kind of speaking really profoundly about their work and also about their faith. Yeah.
Thank you so much for chatting to me about the new book. Just remind us of the title of it, and I'll make sure that there's a link from this interview to it.
Oh, thank you. It is called Priests of History, Stewarding the Past in an Ahistoric Age.
And it's been so interesting hearing about your own journey as well, which is available to read in Coming to Faith through Dawkins, this new set of essays on the pathway from new atheism to Christianity. Been really fantastic to chat with you, Sarah. Thank you for being my guest.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Justin.
So that was a fascinating story about how Sarah moved out of atheism into Christianity. But what about atheists who have not converted, but nevertheless reconsidered what they make of the new atheist movement? Check out my interview with well-known atheist thinker, podcaster, and YouTuber Alex O'Connor next. And you can visit justinbrierley.com for signed copies of my books, a free chapter with the newsletter, and to support my work through Patreon or US tax-deductible giving. Supporters can get free signed copies, early access, bonus content, and monthly catch-up calls with me. That's justinbrierley.com.